In a quiet suburb of Queens, New York, neighbors went about their daily routines, unaware that living among them was a man whose past stretched back to one of history's darkest chapters. For decades, he had blended seamlessly into American life, raising a family, working as a draftsman, collecting a pension. But in 2018, at the age of 95, agents surrounded his modest red brick home and placed him under arrest. He was not alone. Across the United States and Europe, elderly men in their 80s, 90s, and even past 100 years of age have found themselves facing trials for crimes committed more than 8 decades ago. Some had hidden in plain sight for generations, becoming pillars of their communities. Others had even spoken openly about their pasts, never imagining they would one day face justice. These weren't the high-ranking officials or notorious commanders we remember from history books. These were the guards, the clerks, the cogs in a vast machine of destruction who had assumed that time would shield them from accountability. They were wrong. The hunt for the oldest Nazi war criminals represents one of the most remarkable chapters in the pursuit of justice, a race against time itself, where investigators work frantically to bring aging perpetrators to trial before nature delivers its own final verdict. For decades after World War II ended, prosecuting Nazi war criminals required proving that an individual had personally committed specific acts of violence. Guards could claim they were merely following orders. Administrative staff could argue they never harmed anyone directly. This legal standard allowed thousands of former Nazis to escape prosecution, even when their service at concentration camps was well documented. The breakthrough came in 2011 with the conviction of John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian-born auto worker who had lived in Ohio for decades. German courts established a new legal precedent that would revolutionize how Nazi crimes were prosecuted. Simply being present at a death camp and facilitating its operation, regardless of one's specific role, constituted accessory to murder. This legal shift opened the floodgates for a new wave of prosecutions. Nazi hunters scrambled to investigate hundreds of potential suspects, knowing that each passing day meant fewer witnesses, fewer pieces of evidence, and fewer living perpetrators. The race was on to deliver justice before it became impossible. Yet even as this new legal framework emerged, the challenges were immense. Many suspected war criminals were already in their 80s and 90s. Their health was failing, their memories were fading, and proving their identities after decades of concealment required painstaking detective work across multiple continents. But investigators pressed on, driven by a simple principle: age does not diminish guilt, and the passage of time cannot erase the crimes of the past. The stories of these elderly defendants would soon capture international attention, raising profound questions about justice, memory, and the limits of human accountability. Of all the elderly Nazis brought to trial in recent years, perhaps none captured public attention quite like Oskar Groening. By the time German prosecutors charged him in 2014, he was 93 years old and had spent decades living a quiet life as an accountant. But during World War II, he had served at Auschwitz, where his job was to count and catalog money taken from prisoners, earning him the nickname the bookkeeper of Auschwitz. Groening's case was remarkable not just for his advanced age, but for the unusual path that led to his prosecution. Unlike many Nazi war criminals who spent their lives hiding their pasts, Groening had actually begun speaking publicly about his experiences at Auschwitz in the 1980s. His motivation was not confession or remorse, but anger at Holocaust deniers who claimed the extermination camps had never existed. In interviews and documentaries, Groening provided detailed, first-hand accounts of the camp's operations. He described the arrival of transport trains filled with prisoners, the selection process that determined who would live and who would die, and the systematic theft of victims' possessions. His testimony was intended to counter those who denied the Holocaust had occurred, but it also provided prosecutors with self-incriminating evidence. For years, German authorities investigated Groening but decided there was insufficient evidence to prosecute him. The legal standards of the time required proving that he had personally participated in specific acts of violence. His role as a bookkeeper, however crucial to the camp's operations, did not meet this threshold. Everything changed after the Demjanjuk precedent in 2011. Suddenly, Groening's presence at Auschwitz and his role in processing stolen property made him legally culpable for every death that occurred while he was stationed there. In September 2014, prosecutors charged him with accessory to murder in 300,000 cases. The trial, which began in April 2015, attracted worldwide attention. Holocaust survivors traveled from around the globe to testify about their experiences and confront the man who had helped facilitate their persecution. Groening, now 94, appeared in court using a wheelchair and walker, a frail, elderly man facing the weight of history. During the proceedings, Groening offered what many interpreted as an apology. Though he stopped short of accepting full legal responsibility, he expressed remorse for his role in the Nazi machinery and asked for forgiveness from Holocaust survivors and their families. Yet he maintained that he had been a minor cog in a vast system and had not personally harmed anyone. The court was unmoved by such distinctions. In July 2015, Judge Franz Kompisch sentenced Groening to 4 years in prison, declaring that he had knowingly participated in the systematic murder of hundreds of thousands of people. The judge noted that Groening had never requested a transfer from his position at Auschwitz, suggesting his willing participation in the camp's criminal enterprise. Groening's legal team immediately filed appeals, arguing that their client was too elderly and frail to serve his sentence. For nearly 3 years, the case wound through Germany's appeals process, while Groening remained free. His lawyers presented medical evidence of his declining health, claiming that imprisonment would constitute cruel and unusual punishment for a man approaching his 100th birthday. But in November 2017, German courts ruled that Groening was fit to begin serving his sentence, provided he received appropriate medical care while incarcerated. Plans were made for his imprisonment, and it seemed that justice would finally be served. It was not to be. On March 9, 2018, just as he was preparing to report to prison, Oskar Groening died in a hospital near his home. He was 96 years old. The bookkeeper of Auschwitz had escaped earthly justice by a matter of days. His death sparked intense debate about the wisdom of prosecuting extremely elderly defendants. Critics argued that pursuing such cases was mere symbolism, achieving little beyond satisfying a desire for revenge. But prosecutors and Holocaust survivors saw it differently. They viewed Groening's conviction as an important moral victory, even if he never served his sentence. The case established crucial legal precedents that would enable future prosecutions and send a clear message that no one who participated in the Holocaust would be beyond the reach of justice, regardless of their age or the passage of time. But it also highlighted the cruel arithmetic of historical justice. As each day passed, more perpetrators died before they could be held accountable. Yet even as Groening's story reached its conclusion, investigators were pursuing other elderly suspects whose cases would prove even more complex and controversial. While Groening's prosecution unfolded over just a few years, another elderly Nazi suspect had been fighting legal battles for far longer. John Demjanjuk's case would span more than 3 decades, cross multiple continents, and ultimately reshape how Nazi war crimes were prosecuted worldwide. Born in Ukraine in 1920, Demjanjuk had emigrated to the United States after the war, settling in a Cleveland suburb where he worked as an auto worker at a Ford plant. He became a U.S. citizen in 1958 and lived what appeared to be an ordinary American life, raising 3 children and eventually retiring on his pension. But in 1977, the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations received a tip that would shatter Demjanjuk's quiet existence. Documents discovered in Soviet archives appeared to show that he had served as a guard at Nazi death camps during the war. More dramatically, Holocaust survivors identified him from photographs as Ivan the Terrible, a notoriously sadistic guard at the Treblinka extermination camp. What followed was one of the most complex and controversial war crimes cases in history. The U.S. government stripped Demjanjuk of his citizenship in 1981, arguing that he had lied about his wartime activities when he applied for admission to America. In 1986, at the age of 66, he was extradited to Israel to stand trial for crimes against humanity. The Israeli trial was a sensation. Holocaust survivors took the witness stand to identify Demjanjuk as the man who had operated gas chambers at Treblinka and brutalized prisoners with exceptional cruelty. The testimony was harrowing and emotionally devastating. In 1988, Demjanjuk was convicted and sentenced to death, only the second person to receive such a sentence in Israeli history. But Demjanjuk's case was far from over. His lawyers appealed the conviction, arguing that their client had been misidentified. In 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union opened new archives that contained potentially exonerating evidence. Documents seemed to suggest that the real Ivan the Terrible was actually a different person named Ivan Marchenko. In 1993, the Israeli Supreme Court overturned Demjanjuk's conviction, ruling that there was reasonable doubt about his identity as Ivan the Terrible. He was released from prison and returned to the United States, where his citizenship was restored in 1998. It appeared that a grave injustice had been corrected. However, the story took another turn in 1999 when the U.S. Justice Department opened a new investigation. While Demjanjuk might not have been Ivan the Terrible at Treblinka, newly discovered Nazi documents suggested he had served as a guard at other camps, including Sobibor, Majdanek, and Flossenburg. Once again, the government moved to strip his citizenship. In 2002, a federal judge ruled that Demjanjuk had indeed served at multiple Nazi camps and had lied about his wartime activities. His citizenship was revoked for the second time, and deportation proceedings began. But where could he be sent? Ukraine didn't want him. Poland refused to accept him. For years, Demjanjuk remained in legal limbo while his lawyers fought his deportation. The breakthrough came in 2009, when Germany agreed to accept him for prosecution. German authorities had developed new evidence that Demjanjuk had served as a guard at Sobibor, where approximately 250,000 people were murdered. At the age of 89, Demjanjuk was deported from the United States and flown to Germany to face trial. The German proceedings, which began in 2010, were physically demanding for the elderly defendant. Demjanjuk appeared in court lying on a stretcher, claiming he was too ill to participate in the trial. He spoke only once during the entire proceeding, proclaiming his innocence in a brief statement. Unlike the Israeli trial, which had focused on specific acts of cruelty, the German prosecution took a different approach. They argued that simply serving as a guard at Sobibor made Demjanjuk complicit in every murder that occurred there. This legal theory, that presence and participation in the camp's operations constituted accessory to murder, would prove revolutionary. In May 2011, the court convicted Demjanjuk of accessory to murder in 28,060 cases and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. However, he was released pending appeal and allowed to live in a nursing home near Munich. The conviction established the legal precedent that would later enable prosecutions of defendants like Oscar Groening. Demjanjuk would never serve his sentence. In March 2012, while his case was still under appeal, he died at the age of 91. His death automatically nullified his conviction under German law, but the legal precedent his case established lived on. The Demjanjuk saga illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of pursuing elderly war criminals. His case showed that even decades after the fact, new evidence could emerge and new legal theories could be developed. But it also demonstrated how the passage of time could make justice incomplete. Witnesses died, memories faded, and defendants themselves became too frail to fully participate in their own trials. For investigators and prosecutors, Demjanjuk's case was both a victory and a cautionary tale. They had successfully established new legal frameworks for prosecuting Nazi crimes, but they were also reminded that time was running out to apply these frameworks to the remaining suspects. Even as the Demjanjuk case was concluding in Germany, U.S. investigators were pursuing what they believed would be their final Nazi war crimes case on American soil. For years, they had been investigating an elderly man living quietly in Queens, New York, whose past would eventually make him the last known Nazi collaborator in the United States. Jakiw Palij had emigrated from war-torn Europe in 1949, claiming he had spent the war years working on his father's farm and later in a German factory. Like thousands of other displaced persons, he was allowed entry to the United States under programs designed to help war refugees rebuild their lives. He became a U.S. citizen in 1957 and worked as a draftsman, eventually retiring to a modest red brick duplex in the diverse Queens neighborhood of Jackson Heights. For decades, Palij lived an unremarkable life. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, elderly man who kept to himself. He had been married, though his wife had passed away. He spoke with a slight accent that suggested Eastern European origins, but this was hardly unusual in New York's immigrant communities. The first crack in Palij's carefully constructed identity appeared in 1993, when investigators from the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations found his name on an old Nazi roster discovered in Soviet archives. a fellow former guard, under interrogation decades earlier, had mentioned that Palij was living somewhere in America. Following this lead, investigators eventually tracked him down to his Queens home. When confronted with evidence of his wartime service, Palij initially attempted to maintain his cover story, but faced with documentary proof, he eventually admitted that he had lied on his immigration application. In 2001, he acknowledged that he had been trained at the SS training camp at Trauniki in Nazi-occupied Poland, and had served as an armed guard at the adjacent forced labor camp. Trauniki was no ordinary military installation. It was a key component of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to exterminate all Jews in occupied Poland. Guards trained at Trauniki were deployed throughout the death camp system, where they played crucial roles in the systematic murder of hundreds of thousands of people. The facility where Palij served was particularly notorious. On November 3, 1943, approximately 6,000 Jewish prisoners at Trauniki were executed in a single day, one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust. Court documents later established that Palij was present during this period, though he denied any direct involvement in the killings. In 2003, a federal judge stripped Palij of his U.S. citizenship, ruling that he had obtained it through fraud by concealing his Nazi service. The following year, the judge issued a deportation order, ruling that Palij should be sent to Ukraine, Poland, or Germany, or any other country that would accept him. But therein lay the problem. No country wanted him. Ukraine, though technically his birthplace, had no mechanism for prosecuting Nazi war crimes and showed little interest in accepting him. Poland similarly declined to take him. Germany, despite having accepted other elderly Nazi suspects, refused to accept Palij because there was insufficient evidence to charge him with crimes under German law. For more than a decade, Palij remained in legal limbo in his Queens home, while diplomats negotiated behind the scenes. His continued presence in the neighborhood outraged many residents, particularly members of the local Jewish community. Protesters regularly gathered outside his house, carrying signs reading, "Your neighbor is a Nazi," and chanting demands for his removal. The protests intensified over the years, drawing media attention and political pressure. In 2017, all 29 members of New York's congressional delegation signed a letter urging the State Department to resolve the case. They argued that allowing a Nazi war criminal to remain in the United States sent the wrong message about American values and justice. The breakthrough came in 2018, when the Trump administration made Palij's deportation a priority. Behind-the-scenes negotiations with Germany finally yielded an agreement. While German authorities couldn't prosecute Palij, they would accept him on humanitarian grounds and place him in a nursing home. On August 21, 2018, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents arrived at Palij's Queens home. The 95-year-old man was taken into custody and placed on a government-chartered medical aircraft. Hours later, he arrived in Düsseldorf, Germany, where he was transferred to a nursing home in the small town of Aalen. The deportation marked the end of an era for U.S. Nazi hunters. Justice Department officials announced that Palij had been the last known Nazi suspect living in America, closing a chapter that had begun in the 1970s with the establishment of the Office of Special Investigations. But Palij's story had one final chapter. Just months after his deportation, on January 9, 2019, he died at the German nursing home at the age of 95. He had lived less than 5 months on German soil after spending nearly 7 decades in America. The timing of his death raised uncomfortable questions about the wisdom of pursuing such elderly suspects. Critics argued that traumatizing a dying man served no meaningful purpose, particularly since he was never formally charged with crimes in Germany. But supporters of the prosecution maintained that the deportation served important symbolic purposes, demonstrating that the United States would not provide safe haven for those who had participated in genocide. Palij's case also highlighted the complex emotions surrounding late-life justice for Nazi crimes. While his deportation satisfied those who demanded accountability, it also generated sympathy for an elderly man who was separated from his home and community in his final months. The moral clarity that had driven Nazi hunting efforts for decades became muddied by questions about proportionality and mercy. Yet even as the Palij case concluded, investigators were pursuing other suspects whose stories would prove equally complex and controversial. Sometimes the most important evidence in a war crimes case comes from the most unexpected places. For Friedrich Karl Berger, a 95-year-old man living quietly in Tennessee. The key piece of evidence that would lead to his deportation came from an index card recovered from a ship that had been sitting on the ocean floor for more than 70 years. Berger had emigrated to the United States in 1959, settling in Tennessee where he worked and eventually retired. Like many immigrants of his generation, he rarely spoke about his experiences during World War II. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, elderly man who kept to himself and caused no trouble. The Justice Department's Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section first became aware of Berger in 2017 as part of their ongoing efforts to identify remaining Nazi war criminals living in the United States. What made Berger's case particularly intriguing was the unusual source of the evidence against him. In May 1945, as World War II was ending in Europe, the British Royal Air Force mistakenly bombed a German ship, sinking it in the Baltic Sea. The ship contained Nazi documents and personnel records that were presumed lost forever. But decades later, divers exploring the wreck discovered that some materials had survived in waterproof containers. Among the recovered documents was an index card that documented Berger's service at the Neuengamme concentration camp system. The card provided crucial evidence that prosecutors could use to establish his presence at the camp and his role in its operations. Neuengamme was one of the largest concentration camps in northwestern Germany, with a network of subcamps spread throughout the region. Berger had served as an armed guard at one of these subcamps near the town of Meppen during the winter and spring of 1945, the final months of the war. The conditions at Meppen were particularly brutal, even by the standards of the Nazi concentration camp system. Prisoners, who included Jews, political opponents, and nationals from across occupied Europe, were forced to perform outdoor labor in freezing temperatures with inadequate clothing, food, and shelter. Many worked literally until they collapsed and died. Court documents would later establish that prisoners at Meppen were held in atrocious conditions and exploited for forced labor to the point of exhaustion and death. Berger's role was to guard these prisoners, preventing their escape during their dawn-to-dusk work shifts and ensuring their return to the subcamp each evening. As Allied forces advanced toward the camp in March 1945, the Nazis decided to abandon Meppen and evacuate the prisoners to the main Neuengamme camp. This evacuation, lasting nearly 2 weeks, was conducted under inhumane conditions that claimed the lives of approximately 70 prisoners. Court records established that Berger helped guard the prisoners during this forced march. When Justice Department investigators approached Berger in 2017, he did not deny his service at the camp. In fact, he admitted that he had never requested a transfer from his position as a concentration camp guard, suggesting willing participation rather than coercion. He also acknowledged that he continued to receive a pension from Germany that was based in part on his wartime service. In February 2020, after a 2-day trial in Memphis, immigration judge Rebecca Holt ruled that Berger's service constituted assistance in Nazi-sponsored persecution. She ordered his deportation to Germany, finding that his willing participation in the concentration camp system made him removable under U.S. immigration law. Berger's legal team appealed the decision, but the Board of Immigration Appeals upheld the ruling in November 2020. At the age of 95, Berger was ordered to leave the country where he had lived for more than 60 years. On February 19, 2021, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents took Berger into custody at his Tennessee home and placed him on a government aircraft bound for Germany. He landed in Frankfurt, where German authorities took custody of him, though they indicated there was insufficient evidence to file criminal charges. Justice Department officials announced that Berger was the 70th Nazi persecutor removed from the United States since their program began in 1979. His deportation came just days before the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, lending symbolic weight to the action. The Berger case demonstrated several important aspects of modern Nazi war crimes prosecutions. It showed how new evidence could still emerge decades after the war, sometimes from the most unlikely sources. It also illustrated how the legal precedents established in earlier cases like Demjanjuk and Groening could be applied to prosecute individuals based on their presence at camps, rather than specific acts of violence. But Berger's deportation also raised familiar questions about the wisdom of pursuing such elderly suspects. Critics argued that removing a 95-year-old man from his longtime home served little purpose beyond symbolism, particularly since German authorities had already indicated they would not file charges against him. 3 months after his deportation to Germany, Friedrich Karl Berger died at the age of 95. Like Palij before him, he had spent only a brief time in Europe after decades in America. His death marked the end of another chapter in the long effort to hold Nazi war criminals accountable. Yet even as cases like Berger's were concluding, German prosecutors were pursuing what would become the most remarkable Nazi trial in history: the prosecution of a man who, at 101 years old, would become the oldest person ever tried for Nazi-era crimes. In the annals of war crimes prosecutions, no case has tested the limits of late-life justice quite like that of Josef Schütz. When German prosecutors brought him to trial in 2021, he was 100 years old. By the time he was sentenced in 2022, he had reached 101, making him the oldest person ever tried and convicted for Nazi-era crimes. The case of Josef Schütz represented both the culmination and the ultimate test of Germany's late-life prosecution efforts. Born in 1921, Schütz had lived through nearly the entire span of the 20th century. He had witnessed the rise and fall of the Nazi regime, the reconstruction of Germany, the Cold War, reunification, and the emergence of the European Union. Now, in the twilight of his life, he found himself facing judgment for actions he had taken as a young man more than 8 decades earlier. According to prosecutors, Schütz had served as an SS guard at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, located just north of Berlin, from 1942 to 1944-1945. Sachsenhausen was one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazis and served as a model for camps built later. During its operation, approximately 200,000 prisoners passed through its gates, and around 100,000 died there. The charges against Schütz were staggering in their scope. Prosecutors accused him of accessory to murder in 3,518 cases, representing his alleged complicity in the deaths of thousands of prisoners during his service at the camp. The indictment covered a period from late 1942 through the beginning of 1945, when Schütz would have been in his early 20s. The case against Schütz relied heavily on SS personnel records that identified him by name, date of birth, and place of birth as having been assigned to the notorious Totenkopf, Death's Head, division of the SS. These documents, discovered in Nazi archives, provided the documentary evidence needed to establish his presence at the camp during the period when massive numbers of prisoners died. Prosecutors allege that Schütz had participated in various aspects of the camp's deadly operations. This included shooting Soviet prisoners of war, assisting in systematic murders by means of Zyklon B gas, and helping to maintain the hostile conditions that led to thousands of deaths from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The trial began in October 2021 at the Neuruppin Regional Court in Brandenburg, with Schütz appearing in court despite his advanced age and frail condition. The proceedings were complicated by his poor health and mobility issues, but the court determined that he was mentally competent to stand trial and could participate in the proceedings for limited periods each day. Throughout the trial, Schütz maintained his innocence, claiming that he had never been at Sachsenhausen and that the documents identifying him were somehow mistaken. His defense lawyers argued that the passage of time had made it impossible to mount an adequate defense, as witnesses had died and memories had faded beyond the point of reliability. The case attracted significant media attention, both for Schütz's remarkable age and for what it represented about the final phase of Nazi war crimes prosecutions. Legal experts debated whether prosecuting someone over 100 years old served any meaningful purpose, or whether such cases had become purely symbolic exercises. 17 co-plaintiffs, representing survivors of Sachsenhausen and their families, participated in the proceedings. Their presence in the courtroom provided a powerful reminder that the crimes being adjudicated had real victims whose suffering deserved recognition and accountability. The prosecution was led by Cyril Clement, who argued that the evidence against Schütz was overwhelming and that his advanced age did not diminish his culpability. Clement contended that Schütz had not merely been a passive bystander, but had actively participated in the camp's criminal enterprise by accepting his assignment and carrying out his duties as a guard. In his closing statement, Clement addressed the broader significance of the case, arguing that it represented one of Germany's final opportunities to hold Nazi war criminals accountable. He emphasized that the passage of time did not erase guilt, and that justice demanded recognition of the victim's suffering, regardless of how long it had taken to achieve. The defense argued that Schütz was being prosecuted for actions allegedly committed when he was barely out of his teens, in a system where refusing orders could have meant his own death. They contended that he had been a minor cog in a vast machine of terror and should not bear responsibility for the broader crimes of the Nazi regime. On June 28, 2022, Judge Udo Lechterman delivered the verdict. He found Schütz guilty of accessory to murder and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. The judge specifically noted that Schütz had been aware that prisoners were being killed at the camp and that his presence and actions had supported these killings. Lechterman addressed Schütz directly, telling him that by serving as a guard, he had actively participated in the murders that occurred at Sachsenhausen. The judge noted that anyone who tried to flee the camp was shot, and that every guard, including Schütz, bore responsibility for these deaths. The sentence was largely symbolic, as Schütz's advanced age and poor health made it unlikely that he would ever actually serve time in prison. German authorities typically do not incarcerate defendants over 100 years old, particularly those with serious health conditions. Nevertheless, the conviction stood as a legal and moral judgment on his actions. The Schütz case marked what many observers considered the effective end of Nazi war crimes prosecutions. His extreme age, he was born just 3 years after World War I ended, represented the absolute limit of how far back such prosecutions could reach. Few, if any, surviving Nazi-era perpetrators remained who were young enough during the war to face prosecution. Just 10 months after his conviction, on April 11, 2023, Josef Schütz died at the age of 102. He had never served his prison sentence, but his conviction stood as perhaps the final judgment in the long effort to hold Nazi war criminals accountable through the legal system. His death marked the end of an era that had begun with the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and had continued for nearly 8 decades. The pursuit of Nazi war criminals had evolved from prosecuting high-ranking officials in the immediate aftermath of the war to hunting down the last surviving guards and administrators in the 21st century. The pursuit of elderly Nazi war criminals represents an 8-decade effort that began with Nuremberg in 1945 and effectively ended with Josef Schütz's death in 2023. What started as prosecutions of high-ranking Nazi leaders evolved into a desperate race against time to hold accountable the last surviving participants in genocide. The breakthrough came with John Demjanjuk's 2011 conviction in Germany. For the first time, courts established that simply being present at a death camp constituted accessory to murder, regardless of one's specific role. This precedent revolutionized Nazi prosecutions, suddenly making guards, clerks, and other low-level personnel legally culpable for every death that occurred while they served. German prosecutors embraced this new framework with remarkable energy, launching hundreds of investigations in partnership with organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center. They faced enormous challenges. Witnesses had died. Defendants were often too frail to participate meaningfully in trials, and evidence relied heavily on Nazi personnel records discovered in archives decades later. The cases that followed shared common patterns. Defendants were typically in their 80s, 90s, or past 100 years old. They had lived quiet lives for decades, successfully concealing their wartime activities. Most died before serving their sentences, if sentenced at all. Critics argued that prosecuting such elderly defendants served little purpose beyond symbolism. Supporters countered that these trials provided crucial recognition to Holocaust survivors, established important legal precedents, and demonstrated that participation in genocide would never be forgotten, regardless of how much time passed. With Josef Schütz's death at 102 in 2023, the era of Nazi prosecutions has effectively concluded. The U.S. Justice Department won cases against more than 100 Nazi persecutors over 4 decades. German courts tried dozens of elderly defendants in the final years. Yet of an estimated 200,000 people who participated in Nazi crimes, only a small fraction ever faced prosecution. These late prosecutions achieved mixed results in traditional terms of justice, but their broader impact was significant. They established legal precedents now applied to prosecutions involving Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Cambodia, and other conflicts. They provided platforms for survivors to tell their stories and created detailed legal records for future generations. Most importantly, they demonstrated that age does not diminish guilt, and that certain crimes can never be forgotten. The willingness to prosecute defendants past 100 years old sent a clear message about the international community's commitment to accountability for crimes against humanity. The story of the oldest Nazis who were caught and tried serves as both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of a remarkable chapter in historical justice and a foundation for future efforts to ensure that those who participate in genocide will ultimately be held accountable, no matter how long justice may take to arrive. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.